Well, welcome to the TMTG Minute podcast interview. Today we're discussing the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's recently announced plan of action for implementation of 510K and science recommendations. And we're very fortunate to be speaking with Dr. John Smith, who's a partner at Hogan Lovells in Washington, D.C. Hogan Lovells is a highly regarded law firm that includes a medical regulatory specialty that completes 250 to 350 510Ks and over a dozen PMAs each year. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Well, Dr. Smith's practice focuses primarily on assisting medical device companies in successfully addressing FDA regulatory issues. And in addition to his legal expertise, Dr. Smith also has broad medical practice experience as a board-certified, fellowship-trained musculoskeletal radiologist in both academic and private practice. He's a former associate professor at Mass General Harvard Medical School and has extensive regulatory experience representing his clients at Hogan Lovells. As the founding director of Regulatory Affairs Program at CIMIT, which is the Center for Integration of Medicine and Innovative Technology, it's a nonprofit consortium dedicated to medical product development. He's also served as a consultant to the Radiological Devices Panel of the Medical Devices Advisory Committee at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. While in medical practice, Dr. Smith provided clinical care and participated in clinical trials. So, Dr. Smith, you're experienced in the clinical, legal, and regulatory aspects of the medical device industry, and we're very happy that you can make time to share your expertise with us. So why don't we get started?
Certainly.
So historically speaking, medical device manufacturers used to develop products and introduce them into the market in a timely manner as the regulatory hurdles were reasonably low for many products, sort of a build it and get it approved for commercialization approach. However, today's medical device OEMs are being challenged to demonstrate more the value of their devices clinically and economically. Can you talk to us about if you see this trend continuing?
Sure. And certainly, just amplifying your point, there really has been a change in at least the 510K area over the past few years. As you noted, many sponsors literally would block off only 90 days representing the statutory review period for a 510K notice for the entire regulatory process. As you indicated, these days that really isn't the case, that there have been changes at the agency such that many more questions are asked, and we see a much more involved clearance process. And do I see this trend continuing? Absolutely. First of all, FDA is first and foremost a public health organization. And a lot of this has been based on what is perceived to be protecting the public health and fostering good science. Both of those metrics, if you will, are not going to change appreciably going forward. And generally what we see is once regulatory, how should I say it, the regulatory requirements for clearance have been increased. While there might be some ratcheting back as FDA becomes more familiar with the devices, you're usually dealing with a higher baseline, if you will. So I do see the trend continuing on the FDA side, and while I'm not an expert in the reimbursement side of the equation with CMS and the third-party payers, there's also a very concerted push to demonstrate clinical value for these new products in order to secure payment from these third-party payers.
Very interesting. So, curious, in addition to the internal and administrative matters that the FDA put forth, we saw that the FDA's plan of action includes changes to guidance for the 510K approval process. And you touched on that a little bit. Can you outline what you think are the most impactful changes to industry?
Sure. There are a number of changes, and one of the themes with all of this is, first of all, what is going to be subject to the 510K process. That is, what will FDA find substantially equivalent, And secondly, the data requirements if FDA allows something to proceed down the 510K pathway. One of the changes that people have been talking about with regard to particularly the latter and the data requirements is the subdivision of Class 2 into so-called Class A and Class B designations, somewhat similar to Europe. The idea being that Class B would be those Class 2 products that would require clinical data, while Class A or 2A would be products that would not require such data. Is there going to be a subdivision? Hard to say. They have not. FDA has not acted on this. There has been some talk lately about how this resembled a process that was in place many, many years ago that didn't quite work. I think, again, the real question is what are going to be the data requirements for any given device, because FDA is always free to place a device in whatever classification it sees fit. So I think it's a little bit of semantics, and I think the real question is, what kind of data are we talking about for your particular product? One of the issues, too, and this comes back to, what is the regulatory pathway for a device? Will FDA allow you to go forward with the 510K? Is if they don't, there is a process called de novo down classification, at least from a statutory point of view, is available for truly new products. That is, there can't be an existing product code that could cover it, but truly new products that are not substantially equivalent, but pose a low risk to patients. Technically, those devices would automatically be placed in Class 3 if they are found not substantially equivalent, but then they could be eligible for what's called de novo down classification. De novo down classification is basically an administrative process where FDA takes a look at the data that you typically submitted in the 510K notice for the product that was found not substantially equivalent. And then the sponsor submits a petition supporting why the device is low risk and including what we call special controls, or the controls that the sponsor proposes to have govern that device should it be down classified to the agency. And then the agency decides whether or not the down classification is appropriate and then weighs in on the adequacy of the special controls. In theory, it's a good idea. It's getting more attention from the agency. The problem with de novo down classification right now is it creates a new, literally a new regulation in the Code of Federal Regulations to govern this new product category. And the issue is that this is can be an extremely lengthy process. The last de novo down classification that we took over 20 months after filing of the petition before we got clearance. And FDA has been touting how one recently only took, I think, a little under a year. But suffice it to say that it is it's an involved process. FDA is looking at streamlining it, and to the degree they make it harder for products to move forward as 510Ks, the de novo process is going to be necessarily relied on more and more. Finally, we always get the question of what happens to the 510Ks that are actually submitted today or just submitted and are pending. How are they being handled? And the reality, quite honestly, is despite FDA talking about a lot of these changes, they're already in place to a large degree, particularly with split predicates and other concepts, meaning that they're being applied even though FDA is not officially applying them. So the net with that is there probably will not be much change at all. And unfortunately, as I had to tell somebody just the other day who was waiting for a pronouncement from FDA to clear the air and speed things along, it's very unlikely to happen.
Interesting. So there's a lot of changes going on, and you mentioned split predicates. Curious, that's come up, and there seem to be some changes, issues that were identified by the working group that have to do with these split predicates. Can you explain the problem with using one predicate device for intended use and another predicate device for technical characteristics, and how the FDA is interpreting this, and how this may change?
Absolutely. FDA has a long-established history. It dates back to a 1986 guidance document that held that you could use as predicates one device for your indications for use and a separate device for your technological characteristics. And what this did was allow, in practice, well-established technologies to be used for new indications without triggering a PMA. For instance, laser devices, very, very well-established technology in many instances. And to add a new indication for a laser, this would be something that FDA traditionally may have allowed, I should say. I wouldn't say would because it was always tricky using split predicates, but may have allowed under this split predicate paradigm. And it's important to note that this was the place where truly evolutionary devices would make it into the 510K pathway. And the importance is that a pre-market approval is just very onerous. And for many small device companies, it just really isn't a realistic possibility. But the split predicate paradigm, when judiciously applied by FDA, allowed for this evolutionary change and some really important developments in medical technology. Now, what FDA is maintaining, and it's been as recently as a couple weeks ago in some statements by Jeff Shuren and others at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, is that it really isn't legitimate to have separate devices for indications for use and technological characteristics. Again, this is a change from how FDA traditionally viewed this. We at Hogan, our whole practice, we've been seeing this paradigm actually being applied for probably the last at least 18 to 24 months, if not longer, where FDA started to push back with the split predicates. And I think it's still unsettled because, again, if you say that a product can't be 510K'd, you only have two choices, that being PMA and de novo. And if de novo is taking 1 to 2 years, it really does limit the flexibility and just really the economic viability of bringing certain new products to market.
Yeah, interesting. And with substantial equivalence being the real issue with determining if a 510K path is appropriate, do you see that this consideration of split predicates changing maybe the approach that companies take to their regulatory strategy and scheduling like you talked about?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, on every 510K application these days, we do our best, and others in the field certainly do this too, to try to find one predicate that looks like a match on all fours, that at least we can make a reasonable argument that it's an appropriate predicate, that we don't have to have split predicates. As far as managing things, it does, as I implied earlier, it does impact what people are willing to try try to get cleared. Because if you know the answer is going to be no, or you've got a pretty good idea that it's going to be no, or when I say no, I mean they're going to say that it's not substantial equivalent, many people will say, well, we either need to either further restrict our claims so as to get into that 510K tent, or what we're hearing from a lot of sponsors is we're just going to go to Europe and other places outside of the U.S. because there's just too much involved in getting to the U.S. market.
Interesting. I'd like to come back to that point.
Certainly.
So with these changes, it sounds like many of them have already been implemented in practice. but it looks like, given the guidance that the FDA has been providing in their plan of action, they certainly have some dates when they're providing additional guidance and some programmatic and regulatory changes and administrative changes. What changes can OEM or manufacturers and developers expect in the next few months, and are there things that they can strategically do to be ready?
Well, I don't think that there are going to be radical changes in the next few months, Robert, largely because most of the, at least on the pre-market side where I focus, most of that has already been implemented. There is some talk about, extending inspections, for instance, to certain 510K applications, and not that that's de minimis, but that would probably need official action. But as far as actually getting your device before FDA and a 510K notice, I think with regard to the data requirements, with regard to establishing substantial equivalence, all of that is, I won't say largely in place, but pretty much in place. And as most of the folks know who have been dealing with FDA over the past couple years, it's probably as rigorous now as it ever has been, and I don't see it getting too much worse. But how do you deal with it is the obvious question, and really what you raised before. And I think the answer is you just need to take the regulatory process very seriously, particularly if you don't have a chocolate, vanilla, or straightforward product. You really do need to think about the regulatory strategy up front, and part and parcel of that is if you think you're close to a clinical data requirement, if you think FDA is going to say no to a 510K, it's really something where you do want to be talking with the agency either in a pre-IDE or pre-submission type process, just so that you know where you stand. Because one of the things I like to tell my clients, and again, I guess I should say before I launch into this, that it's not wrong to file a 510K notice if you don't know what's going on with your regulatory pathway or data requirements. But let me put it this way. If you do a pre-IDE to explore this, it's a formal submission for informal advice, as opposed to if you file a 510K and you get a request for additional information or, God forbid, a not substantially equivalent letter, you've got a determination in writing. And once it's in writing in that form, with a formal marketing submission, it's that much harder to get FDA to back off its positions.
Yeah, interesting. Well, certainly there's some good news in what you just said, that the changes aren't expected to be dramatic and more incremental changes, and that must be comforting to a degree.
It is. I think the thing that's discomforting to many in the space is that the standards have been raised to such a point where even if the FDA backs off somewhat from where they are right now, they're still very rigorous. And as we've been talking about all along, it does raise substantial hurdles to getting certain products to the market.
Yeah. So a lot of people in industry see these reforms as potentially increasing the cost and complexity of the regulatory approval process, and that could in turn delay or stifle medical technology innovation or decrease investments in technology development and ultimately undermine patient care. And this is particularly true, as you mentioned, for the small startup companies that are very much time dependent, and time is often their critical resource and constraint in terms of cash flow and being able to introduce new innovative products. Are there things that the medical technology industry can do to alleviate some of these concerns in addition to planning? Or is it more a matter of being diligent and engaging an expert like yourself at a firm like Hogan Lovells and understanding what's going on? Or are there things that they can do in their planning, maybe their strategic project planning, that maybe integrate more the regulatory path?
Well, I think it's pretty much all of the things that you mentioned, Robert. It's a situation where is it going to cost more for the foreseeable future and be harder to get products onto the U.S. market through FDA? The answer is unquestionably yes. Are they addressable problems for the vast majority of devices? They are. But just like you said, there are two key elements to this. One is, and obviously it doesn't have to be me, but you need to really have your arms around the regulatory process and seek competent regulatory advice as to how to move forward with products, particularly products that are evolutionary or cutting edge, because that's where the problems develop with FDA. And failing to kind of consider all of that and just treating it like things were maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I can't tell you how many times I've seen that result in a lot of trouble for my clients. The other part of it is you do have to plan on longer time frames and more expenses. It used to be not unusual to get a 510K cleared on the first round for fairly straightforward devices with maybe a wrinkle or two. Now we see 2, even 3 rounds of review by FDA, lots of questions, requests for additional data. I would say for most of my 510Ks that include any clinical data, I would plan on at least 9 to 12 months to get it past FDA. It's just the way they are, and sometimes longer. And if there's anything that's a little bit unusual about your product, again, I would say start thinking 6 to 9 months, because it's not going to be the 3 months or 90 days that it was in the past. You're inevitably going to get questions. Depending on what the questions are, they often need to be sorted out with FDA, and all of that takes time.
That makes sense. Now, you mentioned a plan for additional cost as well. Is that purely the cost for the regulatory submissions, or is it also a matter of taking into account additional data that might need to be produced?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are 3 sources of additional costs, if you will. And the one cost is probably at the lower end of things is engaging regulatory professionals, or just taking the time, and there is clearly a benefit to having a very professional submission to FDA. They're overworked these days. Despite their increased funding, they feel very pressured, and if they can't understand the submission that you've made, it just cascades into problems. So there's going to be more cost in putting together the submissions. But where is the real cost? The real cost, just like you described, is gathering additional data. They ask for additional usability data. They ask for additional preclinical data. They ask for God help us all, clinical data. And all of those have a time and cost factor associated with them. Finally, there is also the factor of lost revenue. I can't tell you how many companies call me up and they say, God, we planned on, our metric was to get this thing through in a year. Well, a year might be a little bit long, but, some part of, they had a obvious date that was a little bit, let's just say, optimistic.
Right.
And they say, geez, FDA doesn't understand. I've got, a burn rate. I've got to be selling product, and FDA is just sitting there. And unfortunately, and we kind of get used to it here in our practice at Hogan and others who do what I do, warp speed for FDA is turning something around in, say, 3 to 4 to 6 weeks. And you can bat an eyelash with these folks with a couple of submissions to work through real serious regulatory problems, and it can take 6, 9, 12 months. before you've even really got an answer. So it's really that, the lost revenue, you don't know where the product line is. That's probably the biggest cost.
Yeah, interesting. That was a great summary. I appreciate that. So, Dr. Smith, earlier you mentioned opportunities for out of the U.S. data or out of the U.S. markets. And it seems that because products are approved more often and faster in Europe, the U.S. is already seen by some as maybe lagging behind Europe in medical device innovation. How will these proposed regulations affect the U.S. compared to, say, Europe's medical device industry?
Well, that's a great question, and it has been the case for years that folks have gotten their pilot data or feasibility data in Europe because it's been so much harder to gather, your initial data to support that big pivotal study to get approval or clearance here in the States.
Yeah.
So people have been going to Europe, and now it's China, it's India, it's Brazil, it's other places for years. And people always came back to the States because just of the size of the market and the money involved. But there's a very interesting dynamic that's coming up, and that is that a lot of these countries and markets are becoming, forces to themselves. And between the fact that many of these markets have easier roads to clearance or approval than the U.S. and FDA do, people are saying, not only do we get the product, say, CE marked so that we can conduct a clinical study here, but that's going to be our primary focus, and maybe someday we'll come back to the U.S. because it's just too expensive for us to think about the U.S. Now, that certainly can impact the innovation we see here in the country. It can drive jobs. It can drive innovation offshore because at some level it doesn't make much sense to develop something here and not be able to use it here. Now, one thing I have to say, and this is kind of an unusual twist, but we do see it. Many regulatory agencies outside of the U.S., particularly those in the EU and some in the Pacific Rim, see FDA as their poster child for how they want to regulate medical devices.
Right, right.
And what does that mean? It means that the new medical device directives in Europe are far more stringent than the old ones, and that increasingly you're starting to run into the same problems in these other jurisdictions with increasing data requirements, harder and harder to get things to market, as you were in the U.S. So, yes, FDA's policies tend to push things offshore, but I guess the silver lining to that dark cloud is that offshore is becoming less hospitable as well.
Interesting. So what countries or regions can be expected to benefit from these changes here?
Well, I think that's hard to say for sure. I think one thing we've definitely seen is Europe, and this has been traditionally the case, has gotten access to innovative technology much sooner. And to the degree that this new technology has been beneficial, there certainly is a benefit to patients. In all fairness, FDA's perspective on this is that the standards in Europe are too low, and that they accept products on the market that end up having problems that we wouldn't tolerate here in the U.S.
Right.
Now other places, the Chinas, the Brazils, it's hard to say how much they're going to benefit, but certainly they've shown interest in developing their own medical device industries, and at least in the case of China, and not too surprisingly, they don't feel as constrained as others about intellectual property that may not be theirs.
Right, right. So are there opportunities for manufacturers to leverage some of the international opportunities? And how receptive will FDA be to OUS outside of the U.S. data?
Oh, in the case of a 510K, absolutely, you can leverage an OUS approval into eventually getting U.S. clearance. And what do I mean by that? FDA will accept outside of the U.S. or OUS data to alone to support a 510K notice. You have to demonstrate that the population is comparable to the U.S. Population and that the standard of care, the medical standard of care, is comparable. But, that can be relatively straightforward in Europe and to some degree other places. Israel comes to mind. And what people have done and what has been successful is that you get, you sell something in Europe, you collect data there under a protocol that you share with FDA, and that then you offer those data to FDA to support a subsequent 510K. Now, if you're talking PMA, it's a little bit of a different road to hoe because you need the majority of your data from the U.S. for statistical purposes for a PMA. What that means is the OUS data will help, but it won't move you to where you want to be. You will have to deal with a large clinical study in the U.S.
Right. Well, of course, the end result of these changes is to improve the overall public health in the states, and that's the aim of FDA, and we have to be optimistic that will be an outcome. And so in addition to those expected improvements in public health through the improvement of product safety of approved products, what improvements to the business environment do you see coming out of this FDA plan of action?
Well, I do think, and it's kind of hand in glove in another related area of regulation, which is the increasing role of third-party payers in general and the U.S. government in particular, I should say, in the provision of medical care. And traditionally what people have done was to move products through the FDA regulatory process with fairly minimal data to the degree that FDA would allow that, and then after they got clearance or approval to worry about securing reimbursement for these new products and services. The upside of the FDA paradigm becoming that much more demanding is that sponsors will likely have more of the data needed to secure coverage and payment up front. And that's going to be a big issue because I think, as is fairly well known, the cost of medical care still is increasing at a rate that's far above the rate of inflation. And unfortunately, sooner or later, and probably sooner the way the fiscal environment looks in the States, there's going to have to be a very dedicated attempt to cut down on costs. And an obvious way for the third-party payers to do that is to look at relative efficacy and whether or not a new product is actually helping patients more than newer, or I should say existing products. Right. And the data will help to establish that, yes, the product does have a place in the standard of care and should be reimbursed because, and we've seen this in a number of instances, and it's not uncommon, where people do get past FDA and they've got a product that they're very excited about, and then they find out that the third-party payers don't want to pay for it. And then you got a problem. Interesting.
Well, we're covering a lot of ground, but it's nice to see that there's some positive impacts beyond the intended impact of improvement in public health. So we've covered a lot of ground, Dr. Smith, and you provided us a lot of great information. Just to summarize that, my understanding for the manufacturers in the medical technology industry, a few of the key points were that they need to reconsider their timing and product planning and business strategy. For a 510K product, 90-day period is no longer adequate. It could be 6 to 9 months for a simple 510K, 9 to 12 for any 510K with confounding items. The process sounds like it's significantly more complex. 510Ks may be classified as A and B. The de novo down classification is an option that may be more often used, but it is also a lengthy process, 12 to 24 months. Data requirements are increasing. The selection of predicate devices needs to consider more carefully appropriate predicates, and split predicates may be more thoroughly investigated. Certainly there's cost impacts. The benefit of some of those additional costs would be by engaging a regulatory affairs professional earlier, preparing the submission more professionally. Will help get these submissions through, but there will be more costs. More data is required, and a big impact, particularly for small firms and entrepreneurial firms, is the time impact on revenue and cash flow. So it may significantly impact their business plan. You mentioned also both an upside of and a challenge with reimbursements that with the additional scrutiny on efficacy and the data to support that, that a truly efficacious product will likely see some improvements in reimbursements, but products do need to demonstrate that efficacy. And then your suggestions for industry to affect this were first engage earlier in pre-IDE and pre-510K discussions with FDA, seek competent regulatory advice, and get that advice early when you're planning your strategy. And, of course, plan for greater time and expense. And then there is an opportunity to leverage the OUS approvals for U.S. 510K clearance, and that may even help with an IDE-type product. Were there other things that you think should be highlighted?
No, I think you did a very good job of summarizing things. I think, the key to all of this is it's a more challenging environment, and you definitely need to plan on that as you move towards getting your new medical device to market.
Good advice. Well, Dr. Smith, we sure appreciate your time and your time away from Hogan Lovells to provide this guidance to folks. Thanks very much for taking the time and providing such useful information.
My pleasure. Very happy to speak with you today.
Thanks kindly.